Philomela, Voice to the Voiceless, Chapter 3, The Empress. As I was applying for my PhD, one of the items on my to-do list was to email former professors and see if they would write recommendations. There was one woman in particular I was intimidated to ask, Minerva. She had been the chair of the classics department at my undergraduate university and had recently retired from a long, accomplished, and eminent career as a teacher, scholar, and author. I wasn't sure if she'd even remember me, let alone be willing to write a letter on my behalf. She responded quickly and wrote that of course I was applying for a PhD. She'd always known I would. She said that it would be a pleasure to do a recommendation for me, and gave helpful advice. She was right there, as she had been in college, rooting for me and providing guidance. Her vote of confidence meant so much to me. When I was about 20 years old, she took me to an upscale women's clothing store after a Latin declamation contest I'd participated in, and bought me a gorgeous new outfit. I hadn't won, had in fact blanked, and had to be prompted a couple times, but she wanted to do something special for me. The skirt looked like a betta fish to me, with swooping green and blue swirls. I still have it and wear it when I need a self-esteem boost. Once she told me that my word was my bond, and all I had to go on in this world, and she said it so firmly and earnestly that it stuck with me. Another time, when I had attempted suicide over a stupid thing with a pretty blonde-haired boy named Adonis, she pulled me into her office, hugged me, smiled at me, and said, "I'm so glad you're still here." It made me glad that I was alive. After I read her email, I pulled a tarot card. I got the Empress. Minerva struck me as an empress in her way. She had established a sphere of influence as a classicist that was international. She mentioned in her email that she'd just returned from a trip to Egypt, and that her time there had given her perspective on Dido, Cleopatra, the Aeneid, and Roman Egypt. She was suggesting research options I might want to consider, and her fascinating observations were a breath of fresh air. I could feel my brain firing up. I thought also of her lovely farm out in the country, which I had visited once, and how she seemed to rule over her kingdom gracefully and effectively. She had published books, given lectures, worked the land on her villa, and kept an understated dignity and classiness about it all. As a leader, she was competent and commendable, I knew from being in her classes. I grinned for days about hearing from her, and noted that she was clearly still one of my idols. Could my life grow like hers, my empire expand? I didn't know, but I wanted to try to emulate her example, to be a just, capable ruler of my kingdom. Whether I got into the PhD program or not, my plan was to move west and make a tiny homestead on some land. I wanted to have a small, self-sustaining house and garden, maybe some chickens. Living off-grid in a simpler, more eco-friendly, less wasteful way appealed to me. In 2016, I had gone so far as to purchase a plot of woods in the south, clear the trees, and have a little cabin built by Mennonites. I was thrilled at the prospect of gaining autonomy to manage my affairs as I saw best. I was researching solar panels and composting toilets, reading about when to sow seeds, when I was offered a full-time job teaching Latin at a Catholic high school across the state. I had reservations. I knew that I most likely would not be happy in a conservative religious environment. I am liberal and non-religious. It seemed like the responsible grown-up thing to do, though. Take the position with a salary and benefits, where I would get to use my master's in teaching and my years of training. I'd been working as an educational consultant, teaching homeschool kids, tutoring, and preparing students for standardized tests like the ACT. I was making decent money. The teaching gig would actually be a pay cut, I found out after I accepted it. But my many jobs as a self-employed contractor did not feel as stable as having one steady job I could rely on. What if my work dried up? And at the time, it was my dream job. I had wanted nothing more than to be a high school Latin teacher for over a decade. Minerva, my former professor, had been the dissertation advisor to my high school Latin teacher, Mnemosyne. Mnemosyne was the reason I wanted to be a teacher. She was the ultimate empress. Her brilliance, wit, and fairness were unsurpassed. If I wanted to be like Mnemosyne, to be a great teacher, then I needed to be in a school. I sold my cabin back to its builders with great sadness and moved to a place where I knew no one. I walked away from the little empire I was trying to create before I even got a chance to see if I could succeed. I doubted that I'd be able to do everything that would be needed on my own. Chopping wood, insulating and finishing the walls, digging a well. How could I stay on top of all that by myself? I was single at the time, had just broken off my engagement to Aeneas. Maybe if I'd had a partner, I wouldn't have felt so overwhelmed by the thought of being responsible for it all as a woman alone. I'd been getting lessons from my friend Cassandra's husband on how to shoot a gun, and was looking into buying one in case I ever needed to defend myself. I hate guns, but I was aware that living solo in the forest could be risky. What if some rednecks got wind that a hippie chick was living in a cabin all by herself and decided to pay an invasive visit? I missed my tiny house, my home that was actually mine, as soon as I'd given it up. I rented an apartment and set about conforming. On the first day of in-service at the diocese, I had to sign a morality contract saying that I would uphold the values of the Catholic Church in my public and private life. A stern-looking nun explained that something like posting about being pro-choice on Facebook could be a fireable offense. If you went to a march to support Planned Parenthood and someone saw you, she said, you would be let go. I almost had a panic attack after seeing my name on that agreement in my handwriting. It was all wrong. I had fucked up. I had a very, very bad feeling. I wanted to scream, cry, vomit, and flip tables like Jesus with the moneylenders, then run out of the building with both middle fingers blazing in the air. I was going to have to act like I was pro-life. I knew that I had made a terrible mistake, a grievous, ruinous error in judgment. I wanted to flee home, wished that I hadn't unpacked my U-Haul. I drove around my new provincial town in a state of horror and shock, my heart racing, my brain scrambling to find some way, any way, out of this dreadful conundrum. I called my sponsor. I was still in AA then, and she tried to calm me down. She seemed to think that I was overreacting, that it wouldn't be that serious. Lots of jobs wanted you to have a professional image, she said. I felt unsettled, though. because my gut knew it would probably end up being worse than my worst fears. I had the sense that I had fallen into a den of vipers. I was right. There is nothing in my life that I regret as much as going to work for that school. The first wish I would ask a genie for would be to take me back to that crossroads and deposit me on the front porch of my little home. I would rather be beaten bloody with clubs full of rusty nails than ever cross the wicked threshold of a Catholic church again. The amazing children I got to teach were the only thing that made it worthwhile. I'd given up my kingdom. My sugar shack, as I'd named it after the fish song, with both storage and sleeping lofts, was gone. Its front porch had been one of my favorite places I ever sat. Now I was going to be stuck in the Dark Ages, or the Inquisition, but I knew on an intuitive level that I was going to be miserable, because I was going to have to bite my tongue and get better at acting. I was going to have to betray my own morals, go against my conscience. To pretend that I wasn't a feminist, that I was okay with hearing about homosexuality being a sin. My grandmother and great-grandmother on Juno's side had been Catholic, and my mother had gone through confirmation and attended Catholic school as a child. But Juno left the Catholic Church as an adult and raised me as some combination of Methodist, Buddhist, and neither. I was not Catholic, had never been, but I had willingly ventured into their cesspool. I felt like an idiot, a whore. I began to loathe my life. I hated myself for selling out. Going back for my PhD was in part an exit strategy. I had applied for a teaching assistantship with a stipend that wouldn't be much, but enough to live on, and thought I could see a way out. After 4 years of teaching at the Catholic school, in essence having gone through high school again, but under their dysfunctional system this second time around, I was desperate to get away. I couldn't wait to break with that oppressive backwards place and consciously construct the life I'd intended to have, a life where I was free, where I could be genuine, where I could tell a homophobe to fuck the fuck off. As a pansexual woman, it was psychologically damaging to be around closed-minded people who would condemn me if they knew my true orientation. I had to wear a disguise for too long. My mask was starting to crack, as was my mind. I despise the Catholic Church more than any other institution that exists. It is my enemy. It is my eternal enemy across time and space. If this were Doctor Who, they would be the Daleks. There was a nun there at the school who gave me chills every time I was in a room with her. I had never felt the presence of such complete evil before. When I listened to her say bigoted, offensive things about liberals, feminists, and gays, and go on about blasphemy, I would stare at her in what I hoped was hostile silence, but not so overt that she'd call me on it, and fantasize about punching her as hard as I could in the face. She made some of the most hateful, aberrant, stupid, and mean-spirited comments I'd ever had to tolerate, and no one would stand up to her because she was married to Jesus. She bullied the other nuns and her students, policing their piety. I think Jesus might have wanted to knock that bitch out too if he'd been there. I generally don't call women bitches because, well, misogyny, but honestly, Fuck that bitch. That nun was a bitch if ever I met one. Then there was the deviant monster of a priest who made my students cry on a regular basis. He told them dogs couldn't go to heaven because they didn't have the right kind of soul, among other nasty little sound bites. His homilies were bellicose and insane. He sang Mass to be more old school, but seemed oblivious that he sounded like a much less charming Kermit the Frog. I thought most days about sucker punching him, too, but more often I daydreamed about going full Linda Blair from The Exorcist on him, whipping out a can of pea soup and a crucifix and having a field day. I imagined how gratifying it would be to frighten him, to be sinister like he was, to make him uncomfortable like he did me and many of the kids, to make him squirm. I knew that the answer wasn't to become malicious, full of rage, but it was happening. I had no Christ love for the nun and the priest, just an Old Testament wrath. When I didn't get into the PhD program, and Hades and I broke up shortly after, I was devastated. All my dreams had come crashing down at once. The empire of graduate school and the empire of love slipped from my fingers. I shied away from going ahead with the empire of my tiny homestead again. The plague happened that spring, and I elected to stay put, to be there for my students. Until I was fired for attempting to be cautious about the plague. The irony that I compromised myself away for those people, became a shell of a human being, and they gave me the axe for trying to safeguard life, which they claimed to hold as sacred. The Holy Roman Empire, the ancient Romans before them, their empires thrived on oppression and force. My country has begun to remind me of the worst of Rome as it was falling. Within this evil empire of greed and ignorance, I am proud to be a dissident, and I am ready to carve out my own empire. The one I got a glimpse of years ago from my front porch. One where trees, homegrown produce, quiet, goats, firewood to split, books to read, enough darkness to see the stars at night, frogs, crickets, and minimalism live. Growing up, my mother seemed like the Empress of my world. After my father moved out, we had our spacious 4-bedroom house with an acre of land to ourselves. Our backyard was like a park. I had a swing set, a playhouse with a slide, a kiddie pool, all sorts of toys. My mother would sing "You Are My Sunshine" while she pushed me on the swing. We did not become poor until later. In the beginning, I was lavished with treats and treasures. My mother loved to have family and friends around. Her niece Aphrodite, who had a daughter about my age, Vesta, lived with us for a while. Other cousins and relatives came and went like a revolving door. In my early days, women were in charge. There were men present, too, but they were there to talk and make jokes and music, not to dominate. It felt like every day was a party, an adventure. We would often stay up late, kids and grown-ups alike, and I remember running outside to watch the sunrise with Vesta, swinging at dawn as my mother's clear, songbird-like voice rang out. I remember watching my mother and her friends drink coffee and converse and play their guitars for hours, with periods of jubilant laughter. That laughter was powerful, I knew even as a little girl. Bad things would happen, usually bad things the men did, but the women would find the humor and carry on, continue washing the dishes, paying the bills, and feeding the children and dogs. The women were resilient and joyful. We had fun. I knew I was loved and would be taken care of. Later, after my mother remarried Mars, my first stepfather, I saw her change. They got together when I was 5. Mars was a furniture mover and stagehand for concerts. Muscular, tall, imposing. He put Juno's savings up his nose and brutalized her body. We left our house when I was 7 to get away from him, and also because we could no longer afford the rent. My father owned the house and was our landlord. He'd set things up so that the rent increased dramatically every year. My mother and I moved out to a small duplex in the country. She and Mars made up, and he came to our new home and continued his reign of terror. He put Juno in a weakened position. He was abusive and hooked on hard drugs, methamphetamines, and cocaine. While I may seem like someone who condones drug use, I know all too well the volatility that can result from unchecked addiction. There are some substances that it is better to avoid altogether, as their hazards outweigh whatever minuscule positives there could be. Mars had a brother, his best friend Achilles, who murdered his wife Penelope while out of his mind on methamphetamines. Achilles also shot her brother and sister-in-law dead, in front of their children and his own. He had dressed in camouflage, put black face paint on his cheeks, cut the phone lines of Penelope's brother's house, kicked in the door, and gone after the adults with a shotgun. Penelope died on her knees, begging for her life. Achilles had the highest level of methamphetamines the state examiners had ever seen in his system. Oprah did a special on my former step-uncle, whom I had known well, before he was executed. He remained arrogant until the bitter end. I used to play with Achilles and Penelope's children, a boy and a girl around my age. His daughter was visibly afraid of Achilles, would cringe when he came in a room. She told me once in a hushed whisper that he would kill her if she ever dated a black man. Penelope had almost come to stay with us instead of her brother. She was planning to leave Achilles. My mother wanted to offer her a safe place, but Mars didn't want to betray his brother by harboring her there. Mars and Achilles were doing the same drugs and attached at the hip. Mars threatened to do what Achilles had done to my mother and me. He tried to kill us several times. One time my cousin Aphrodite called the house to see where my mother and I were, and he told her that he had buried us in a shallow grave in the backyard. She wasn't sure if he were serious, which says a lot. He chased my mother with a pair of scissors and said he was going to bury them in her chest, and he came close to doing so. He almost bashed in my skull, slamming my head with my bedroom door when I was 10 years old. Juno and I had to go into hiding, and Mars finally left our life for good when I was 11. My mother had let him so far inside the borders of her kingdom that she wound up enervated. Much like with Queen Dido of Carthage welcoming a stranger into her lands, my mother's soft heart was her undoing. Mars left lasting scars on her psyche and mine. From Mars, I internalized the lesson that I did not have a say over what happened to me, not really. I lived at the mercy of a man, what he chose to do. No, I see now, I do get to choose. I am pro-choice in every way a person can be pro-choice. I am eager to make my tiny homestead dream happen, and to stick with it this time. There will be a learning curve, setbacks, and headaches, maybe even disasters here and there, but I am ready to undertake the administration of my Eden. There is no reason that I cannot be an empress. I don't need to be a man to be the ruler of my domain. I don't need to have a man by my side to rule either. I just need to take care of business. If the roof leaks, get it fixed. If I need fuel, buy it. Whether working for the Catholic Church or being married to the god of war, an abusive relationship is an abusive relationship. No man will ever be able to lord his power over me again. Not a boss, not a lover, because I will not hand my independence to anyone else. The one with the final say will be me. I want to be a queen, but an empress would also suffice. Either way, I will not do as I am told, and mindlessly fall in line with madmen. I will pick up the ledger books and make sense of them, determine what resources are available, and how to acquire anything else required for the smooth running of operations, be it dog biscuits or a generator. I will be slow to form alliances, and only enter into ones that feel sound and necessary. Two of the most impressive empresses I ever knew were my Aunt Sybil and her wife Sappho. Theirs was a double empress household. I lived with them for 9 months, the same amount of time as a pregnancy, after I ran away to New York City in 2008, and I used to joke that they were my surrogate lesbian moms. They are nurturing, responsible, wise, generous, intelligent, talented, hilarious, honest, kind, and strong women. They taught me so much about taking care of business. Whether it was preparing nutritious meals or working on a creative project, they were on point. They could hash out the details and find a way to do whatever needed doing. Though they did not have biological children, they both took me under their wings as if I were theirs. Not long after I started staying with them, Sybil told me that Psyche, her grandmother, my great-grandmother on my mother's side, who had passed away when I was 2 years old, said to her one day when she was a child, "You belong to me." Sybil said the same thing to me. It made me cry. I will forever be grateful to Sybil and Sappho for caring for me and being such marvelous role models. They were the healthiest example of a married couple I'd had in my family, and I will never forget our Chelsea mornings, drinking coffee and meditating together. One day we tried a laughing Buddha meditation, where we set a timer and laughed for 20 minutes without stopping. By the end of it, we had tears in our eyes, and our stomachs hurt, from how we kept making one another laugh even harder with our snorts, guffaws, and funny faces. Their kingdom was one of cheerful, sunshiny yellow walls, nourishing food, incredible art, trinkets, tea, music, film, thoughtful presents given without strings, and freedom to be yourself. I first learned about tarot cards from my aunts and their delightful friend who would come over on weekends to have dinner and do readings for us. My aunts kept their tarot cards in a wooden box with a carved, colorful picture of the magician on the top. I later made a painting of the magician card for them. It was the first time I'd used an epoxy coating, and I was pleased with how it turned out. When I worked for the Catholic Church, I found it absurd that I couldn't talk openly about things like the tarot that were considered occult and evil, and I felt as if I were betraying my aunts by affiliating myself with people who would call their beautiful love a sin. Uh-oh, I lost signal. No, come back, chapter. Brief intermission. Okay, back to it. What do they have in common? These variations on the Empress card. Minerva, Nemozan, I can't word. Mnemosyne, my mother, Sybil, Sappho, and myself. We have all most likely bumped up against naysayers, most likely men, who didn't like it that we sought more than the box they wanted to put us in. Didn't understand how we had the audacity to conduct ourselves more like a man would, instead of following prescribed gender roles. Wanted to make us shrink and shine less, strip us of our resolve to make our own decisions. The Empress is opposed by forces of toxic masculinity, but when she steps into her power, she will never be imprisoned again, certainly not willingly. It would take a fierce fight to make an Empress bow, and she would probably win. The double-edged sword is that it will all be up to me as an Empress. If I fail, that's on me. There won't be a husband there to pick me up and dust me off. No emperor in sight. But this is good, in the sense that another person's shortcomings or lapses in judgment will not affect me. If my ship is not tied to anyone else's, it will not go down if theirs capsizes. As for the imagery of the card, the Empress is seated, propped up with red and orange cushions. She is holding a scepter and wearing a crown made of stars. Next to her is the Venus symbol, a circle with a small cross below it, which often stands for female. Her white dress is flowing and luxurious, and it is covered in what appear to be fruits or flowers that resemble the Venus symbol. In the background are lush green trees, with a stream running through them, and in front of her what looks like wheat. She has a very Earth Mother vibe, and indeed this card can mean pregnancy, motherhood. You can almost see the Empress's children running through the fields around her. It is easy to picture her as a matriarch, surrounded by the shouting and giggling of her babies as they play on her estate. She feeds them, clothes them, protects them, maybe even spoils them. The Empress is a defender of the young, a mama bear. But what of the reversed Empress? The Empress thwarted in her desires to procreate. When I was a little girl, I loved my dolls, like many little girls. As previously mentioned, it was complicated with Louise, but for the most part, I was a loving doll mother. I pretended that they were my babies, or my friend Juturna and I would play our favorite make-believe game, that we were sisters, and that our dolls were our younger siblings we had to look after because our parents were dead. We were keeping them safe from our uncle, an evil wizard who had killed our parents. We were weird kids with vivid imaginations. I had thoughts about when I would be a mother, not if. There was a history of teenage pregnancy in my family. My Aunt Rhea, my mother's oldest sister, had her first child at 14, and went on to have a total of 7. Rhea is an Empress as well, a caring, loving, giving woman. She did much to help raise me. Rhea's 2 daughters also had their first children before they turned 18. I loved my cousins Aphrodite and Demeter, and their children, but starting when I lost my virginity at 16, I took precautions to avoid becoming a mother before I was ready. The first time I consciously tried to get pregnant, I was 26 years old. I was living with and engaged to Orpheus, whom I hadn't been with very long, but felt maniacally certain about. I figured it would happen right away, as soon as we stopped using contraception. I had started to hear the ticking of my biological clock, and the intensity of it would take over my body, how badly I wanted to have a baby. We bought a baby carrier to wear on our backs when we went hiking, before we knew if conception had occurred. Conception never occurred. I didn't know it yet, but I have polycystic ovary syndrome, and I am infertile. In my early 30s, when I was with Bacchus, I did 4 rounds of treatment to make me ovulate, but I never got pregnant. Looking back on the potential fathers I chose, I am grateful that I could not conceive. I would have adored my children, devoted myself to them, made them my new center of gravity. I would have read them books and taken them on nature walks. It has been difficult to come to terms with not being a mother in this lifetime. But my infertility might be my saving grace. Had I borne those men's children, I would have remained tied to them, and they would not have been pleasant to co-parent with. A symptom of my polycystic ovary syndrome is high testosterone, and I shave my upper lip, chin, and neck so I don't grow a mustache and beard. I would have in essence had to be both mother and father, the man of the house. It would have fallen to me to do the work of providing for and raising the children. Having my offspring's survival rest squarely on my shoulders would have drastically altered the trajectory of my life. I like to think I would have risen to the occasion, been a good mother. I was a stepmother to Bacchus's son Orion for a while, and I adored him. He was a tender, precocious boy, and my loyalty to him was a big part of why I took so much crap from Bacchus. Orion had a keen creative side. He loved to write and draw, to make comic strips. I did everything I could to praise and encourage his efforts. Gave him notebooks and colored pens. I bought him toys and clothes, prepared his meals, tended to him when he was sick. But he did not come from my body, so he left my life when his father did. I will always wonder about him and wish him well, though. He was my dear little friend. Sometimes I grieve for them, the babies I never got to hold, the ones I might have had. Orpheus had a drinking problem and a vicious temper, but maybe our child would have gotten his artistic ability, his prodigious musical talent. Would we have had a son or a daughter? He wanted to name a boy Mountain. I liked the name Ariadne, Addie for short, for a girl. We would talk about baby names before bed, read them out loud from a book I had. I also tried for a baby with my third fiancé, Aeneas. Nothing took. Aeneas was one of the better men I was with, kind, not abusive, generous, but I was not really in love with him. When I broke off our engagement, he turned cold, cruel, and vindictive. I would not have wanted to co-parent with him either. But Aeneas was cute and smart. He looked like Harry Potter. We might have made a cool human being. I tried again with the Minotaur, my first husband. With him, I was determined. I was 32 when we married, and I was beginning to suspect that there might be something wrong with me. I bought ovulation test strips and taped them into a shoebox lid, labeled them with dates and times, hoping to see the bold purple line that would indicate a surge of luteinizing hormone. Month after month, no surge came. If I held the strip just right, the line looked a little darker, and I could convince myself maybe it was brighter than the control line, but I never got a true positive. While I was scrutinizing my pea stick collection in my shoebox lid, the Minotaur started doing opiates and benzos again, hiding it from me. One night I wound up having to take him to the emergency room because he'd overdosed, much to my surprise, as I thought he was still sober. We'd met in recovery. I'd never been into opiates or benzos, but they'd been a major problem for him. There were starting to be some tells that he'd relapsed, like how he nodded off into a slice of pie and got whipped cream in his beard. But I was in denial, until I could no longer avoid facing the stark reality in front of me. As I sat in a hard, straight chair next to my snoring husband in his hospital bed, I wept from the betrayal. It hadn't just been me he could have harmed, which he did, attacking me in a blackout before I got him help, and might have saved his life that night. His hard drug use could have caused health problems for the fetus that would have sprung from that chemical cocktail of heroin, Roxy, ecstasy, Xanax, booze, and everything else he was on. He disgusted me. I couldn't fathom that he would put those things into his body while trying to have a baby with me, all the while telling me how excited he was, how he couldn't wait to be a dad. I had been oblivious, a good little sober teacher and wife, taking prenatal vitamins. I tried to work on things with him for a few more months, but for all intents and purposes, our marriage ended that night in the ER, when I grasped how selfish and careless he was. My first husband was not very attractive, being half man, half beast. I would have loved any baby, even if it came out with bull horns, but I do not regret that I did not have the Minotaur's baby. Then there was Bacchus, my second husband. With him I tried the hardest. I did not want to admit defeat. I finally went to a specialist and got my diagnosis. The doctor was hopeful. I took a heavy-duty medication used to treat breast cancer, and it made me terribly sick. I did not respond well to it, projectile vomited, had excruciating pains in my ovaries and uterus, but kept at it for 4 months. A month longer than I was supposed to take the drug, because I wanted to be sure that one last round wouldn't do the trick. I saw what Orion was like, how sweet and intelligent he was, and I wanted to make another human being like him, to give him a brother or sister. I am so lucky that I failed. Bacchus was the worst of them all. He eroded my self-esteem, as he both tore me down emotionally with his verbal vitriol and injured my body with his fists. I am thankful that no infant was there to witness him choking and kicking me. At some point after Bacchus, I stopped wanting to have a child. It snuck up on me gradually, at 35, that it was no longer a driving, motivating force. If I found out today that I were pregnant, which would have to be a miracle of some sort, I would be thrilled. I would want to do everything I could to nurture a little person and help them thrive. But I have made peace with being a childless woman, and I may have even come to prefer it. While it is a privilege to get to interact with my friends' kids, to be an auntie by choice if not a biological one, it is also convenient to be able to go home when I've had enough and would like some alone time. I have immense respect for mothers. I know that my own made countless sacrifices for me, and that motherly love does seem to consist of being willing to give up your life to preserve the life of your beloved child. My hat is off to mothers. Theirs is a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, often thankless job. They are never really off the clock. Even when sleeping, they might at any minute be awakened by a bawling child covered in poop and/or puke. When I consider how different my life would be if my days were dictated by child care, on some level I do breathe a sigh of relief that it's just the cats, the dog, and I. Cleaning the litter boxes and taking Cerberus to potty keep me busy enough. I have known my friend Cassandra since I was a frightened ninth grader fresh out of homeschool. We were introverted poetry-writing girls who sat together in the back of Latin class and passed letters back and forth in our notebooks. I have watched Cassandra grow into one of the best mothers I have ever known. She is patient and gentle and goes out of her way to take her children's emotions into account. She is also disciplined and hardworking. Not only does she show up for her own kids whenever and however they need her, but she teaches in the inner city and cares for other people's babies as if they were her own. She is a social justice warrior and an empath. She has overcome more than her fair share of hardships, endured blow after devastating blow, when any one of those calamities individually could decimate someone. Too often have her intuitions and predictions been exactly right, but she has not been believed. Cassandra's youngest child, Atalanta, is a spirited pixie of a girl, a gem, a wonder to be around. Cassandra has dark hair and eyes, but Atalanta has blonde hair and blue eyes, and radiates sunshine. I see so much of my friend in Atalanta, as if she is a golden miniature version of her mother. They have the same expressive faces, with the same beaming, gleeful smiles, and the same infectious laughter. They are full of energy. They are goofy, entertaining, and hilariously funny. They are also brilliant, talented, and tough. I see how determined Cassandra is to do everything in her power to help Atalanta avoid the quicksand traps that almost claimed her life. I too want to protect Atalanta and all children, to keep their lights bright. I am proud of the champion of the oppressed and of her daughter's self-confidence that Cassandra has become. May Atalanta be spared the trials her mother persevered through, and may her torch never dim. Cassandra's voice, when she speaks to her children, is soft, soothing, and safe. She restores my faith in humanity when I witness her transmuting her tragic past with her startling resilience and compassion. My friend Cleopatra is also an extraordinary mother to her 2 daughters and baby son. Hers is a world of play, of imagination, of laughter, of unicorns. Cleopatra has a way of speaking life into things. She has a realness, a straightforward manner that is refreshing. She speaks her mind, so you know where you stand with her. She has a huge heart, so much love to give. She has at times been there for me as if she were my mother, and as with my mother, her sense of humor is a force of nature. She is brave enough to tell me when she thinks I'm being foolish, and she has helped me out of more jams than I can count with her loving but unyielding honesty. When I got lost in Dicksand over the years, she would remind me that I was a strong, independent woman and needed to return to my center. We were roommates in college, shared an apartment, and she was the person who taught me how to put on makeup. I still think of her attention to detail and her love of rich, jewel-toned colors when I wear eyeliner and shadow. Cleopatra is loyal, a leader, an entrepreneur, a multifaceted woman. She is a graphic designer, an esthetician, a writer, a mentor, a life coach, a lioness queen. She has many aptitudes and can wear many hats. She is frugal, a couponing maven. She values peace and simplicity. She is always striving for improvement, going back to the drawing board and trying something new, whether it is a better way to organize her closet or a commitment to eating healthier. She is pragmatic and capable of running a home and a business and creating abundance from nothing. She takes the time to listen to her young daughters, to really hear what they have to say and embolden them in finding their voices. She cares about how her little girls feel and who they are as individuals, and I suspect she will raise the kind of son anyone would be fortunate to know, a man who will treat women with respect. While I admire and am vaguely jealous of the Empress who gets to have it all, the Empress who both manages her kingdom well and is a mother, I also recognize that there are perks to being the Empress reversed. There are no interruptions when I write. I would not feel so free to travel in my mind with hallucinogens, as I sometimes like to do, if there were a child to take into account. I do not feel like as much of a degenerate for fancying myself a psychonaut and a witch. As is, the only one I might endanger is myself. I do see that there can be perils to drug use, even pot and shrooms, and most likely would not partake if I had kids, at least not as often or around them. I would probably tone down my lifestyle. But what is the harm, really, in being a single, childless adult woman who occasionally ingests sacraments that bring her personal satisfaction and healing insights? It has been a challenge to overcome a decade of brainwashing in 12-step rooms, brainwashing that still gives me shame about doing things I love and being more or less responsible about my consumption. I should be able to let some weeds and mushrooms live in my garden if I so choose. There are many ways to be an empress. If the empress is content and being kind to those around her, juggling the plates that are hers to keep in the air while doing no harm, then she is doing very well indeed. The empress often exists for others. Who takes care of her? May she remember to nurture herself as lovingly as all the other beings who rely on her.